to the social communities of the Agri and Kodi, which are dependent for their livelihood, and also the economic flourishment of the Bombay as a commercial city. For research methodology, I have used the field visits and field observations of salt pans, focus and depth interview method, GPS Google Earth software to kind of to measure the salt pans, empirical analytical research methodologies adopted, and cartographic analysis used for various maps of the Bombay's harbor. I will begin with my Bombay archipelago. Initially, it was cluster of the seven islets on 18th in 18th and 19th century in colonial period. So basically, as we know, Bombay Island is it was of versatile feature. Island is flat land. It was surrounded by the small massives on both the sides. And according to 1876 report written by Patwardhan, the length of these hills were about 18 miles and breadth of the massives were 3 miles. And basically, which measures about 5 to 7 miles in total length. Due to its ultimate proximity near seaward side, Bombay Island it was protected. So as we know, the northern part it was Salsette Island, Bandra was part which was connected to south by bridge, and the huge size of this land mass kind of kind of boosted the huge size of the steamboats. Always they kind of moved in the dockyards of various seaports. So as we know that in 19th century, the transformation of the Bombay Island it started taking place. So land reclamation substantially flushed it, and it could not able to suss out the food security problem of the Bombay Island. So reclamation purpose it was of creating the agricultural land for the Britishers on the scattered islets of the Bombay and to collect the revenue. So geographical conceptions could be the driving element in changing the environmental landscape of the Bombay. So basically, the modern city of the Bombay took the shape in 19th century. Embankments were built, hills were kind of flattened, and rubble dumped into the marsh. So this is very important when we come to the transform geographical land transformation, which started by 1838 when first comprehensive plan to reclaim the land and grow the city's boundaries established. So private companies included started including the Bombay, and reclamation companies reported 95% of the capital of those registered areas between 1863 to 1865. And the more land in the Bombay became habitable and terrain which was commercially exploited. Then we should know these salt pan formation factors along the coastal creeks of Vadala Sivri. There were two natural factors. First is like Mumbai, it was gifted. The Mumbai it was gifted with the hot and humid climate, periodically causes the creek water to evaporate that leads to salt pan formation. And second was sedimentary depositions of the sand, salt, mud, which encrusted on the extensive flat surface on the coastal creeks of Vadal and Sivri. So as we know that, as we have highlighted the two regions, which is my research area study, this is the eastern coast of the Bombay Harbour, which was started transforming, and these are the salt pan marshes, which are basically the flat expanses of the flat land, basically found in the deserts and along the coastal region, which is considered a flat and source of saline body. And standing water is inevitably ephemeral feature. And because of the conducive weather patterns of the Mumbai, the hot and humid climate, that it started kind of precipitating the minerals, natural minerals on the flat surfaces along the coastal lines, which has kind of attracted the colonial interest for exporting the salt as a cheap commodity. This is the diagrammatic representation that started happening naturally in the in the various geological periods along the coastal creeks of the Bombay's harbor. So basically, initially in the coastal colonial period, the three sites were kind of very conducive sites, which were kind of turned into the salt pans. So according to the colonial records, the Worli, Sivri and Vadala on the kind of eastern seashore, and Worli on the western seashore, one kind of the patches of the salt pans were formed. Then, as you can see, the salt basically currently there are basically the four patches of the salt pans flanking along the edge of the Bombay Port Trust Road, which I have visited. And first salt patch is elongated, rectangular in shape, flaked into the numerous salt plots. by bunds to prevent from any further inundation of the creek water. So you can see basically the electric towers are erected on the southern side of the salt pan land, some scanty dry bushes. One pipeline which I've seen that when I interrogated with the owner of the salt common salt manufacturing company, they said that pipeline it was kind of dredged to draw the water, saline water from the coastal side. It was established in 1995 when the after the colonial period, when the kind of techniques of salt extraction in the along the coastal seashore, it was drastically changed. So so basically, there was a salt trade which was flourished in the Bombay, and the salt trade is basically there were the three ports of the Bombay Island. The first is the Powder Works seaport. In the South Bombay, which salt was not supplied. The Mashit seaport, salt was supplied as a cargo, and in the Mallet seaport, salt was not supplied. So only the Mashit seaport, which was very important as kind of exported the salt as a cheap commodity. So these are the kind of salt pans when I visited, then the field visit along the Bombay Port Trust Road, and this is the pipeline which kind of dredging out the saline water from the coastal creek area of the basically Bombay, Sivri and Wadala. And basically, this pipeline it was established, which denotes that the borewell kind of started digging out in the land in the coastal area. And basically, this line pipeline it was extensively used after 1995 and pre 1995 decade in colonial period. Natural process of the salt extraction have been carried out by the coastal communities of Agri and basically Kodi. So this is the salt pan patches of the Wadala Sivri coast along the fringe of the Bombay Port Trust Road, which I have measured basically. So basically these are the salt pans, and this is the Bombay Port Trust Road, and this is the salt pan area. This basically salt pan patch. Total area accounts for 60.55 hectares, but according to the owner of Common Salt Manufacturing Company, which was established in 1915, only the 112 acres of the land it was kind of the salt extraction was done. So basically the concluding part that there were many kind of emergence of the many private salt companies established in the Wadala, which was kind of taking the share of the salt production from that land. But initially, if we see the total area, it was 60.55 hectares. But according to the owner, only the 112 acres of the land was procured. It was used for procurement of the salt. This is the location of the Common Salt Manufacturing Company, and this is the basically salt pans of Wadala Sivri Coast. So basically, role of the Common Salt Manufacturing Company. This is very important because according to the owner, salt pans were formed naturally in the colonial period when the company established in 1955 decade. And after that, the in colonial period, the salt pans had functioned naturally and by using the sea water of the creek. And total area, according to them, is 112 acre. And after that, the owner of the company also significantly pointed out that as a prelude for the process of degradation of creek and kind of the sea face rivulets, causing the kind of shriveling and diminishing the size of the salt pans due to the increasing land reclamation, dumping of the debris, and due to the kind of the increasing environmental degradation, it has resulted in completely into sewage channels. So salt, so they initially in colonial period, salt was exporting as a kind of internationally and also domestically. But after that, salt was started supplying locally. It was not exported. So after 1995, the method and technique of salt extraction used by various the old historic common salt manufacturing company drastically changed on the Wadala Sivri coast. They started constructing the bore wells. The bore wells were dug out to draw the saline creek water for salt production. And after the salt production, which was accumulated, it was exposed for processing kind of under the sun rays for increasing density. Then it got poured into the salt pans. And also the kind of superintendent of the salt, deputy salt, which is the officer, which is situated, their office is situated at the Entophil. They also kind of started kind of noting that the salt production it was diminished because of urban land reclamation started post 1996 decade. So basically, colonial period technique, if we see, if we look at the kind of the salt extraction which was carried out on the Savory coast, it was very different from the now. So flat land, it was adjoining the Savory Creek, cleared the agriculture operations. So first, the land was kind of cleared, like agriculture operations. Then they naturally kind of constructed the grooves on the patches of the flat surface for collecting the seawater. And then salt extraction generally starts with the onset of the summer from February to the May. So basically, when I interrogated with the salt workers, were kind of working on the salt pans of the Wadala and Sivri, they said that basically salt extraction process and work starts with February with onset of summer and ends till the May, kind of the prior the beginning of the monsoon. Then, as we know that whitish creamy layer formed on the
Yeah.
surface, it gets hardened, which appears in the form of salt deposit.
Right now
So this was
51.
a salt extraction technique. This is the basically the field visit which I have done
City
on
out of
12th
6.
November to Superintendent of the Salt Office at Vadala. Basically, these are the basically coastal community which have been captured while working on the salt pans of Vadala and Sivri.
Vishal,
Yes,
you have
yes,
2
ma'am.
minutes more. Okay.
Okay. So as we know that historical techniques of coastal agri community, so in Thane they were using the different techniques for salt extraction by kind of embankment construction stones. This is the deplorable condition we can see in the 21st century. The debris is being dumped on that. The Maharashtra Kharlands Act basically in 1979 introduced some of the reclamation of tidal land, which was very derogatory for environmental degradation. My analysis of the my analysis of the research is basically total salt production of the single common salt manufacturing company is from only 112 acres of land. But when I measured the actual flat land, it was encrusted with the salt is total 60.55 hectares. So this is my measurements of barren salt pans of Vadala. I would like to conclude that basically salt pans are the geomorphological terrain of the coastal geography of Bombay Harbour, which basically intricate inherent relationship we can see salt pans to the Bombay's harbour and economic proliferation and development of Bombay as a crucial seaport. Bombay as a commercial seaport in Asia, and it has also linked with the growth of coastal agri communities and their survival. We can see the environmental degradation in 21st century after the urban land reclamation, and also the common salt manufacturing company. As we measured, there are two possibilities. Salt pan, it has become barren due to human encroachment post 1950s decade, and total area of 1655 of hectares of land is not completely utilized by the common salt manufacturing companies, and other salt manufacturers might be having shares in the salt production from existing land. So as we know that salt pans are reducing in the size and posing the major environmental threat to the coast by flooding. So salt pans must be preserved because they also serve the kind of traditional coastal communities, the culture of the agri-coastal communities, also the natural phenomena which serve the which has led to the development of Bombay as a commercial seaport and also as a natural kind of the heritage. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishal, for that presentation. That's really nice. What's that? Okay. Yeah. So now I'd like to call upon our next participant, Purva Mhatre. I think she's here. She can. Purva, you can start your presentation.
Yes.
Purva, you have 10 minutes. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So, a very good morning to one and all present here. My name is wait, oh my God, sorry, I didn't share my screen.
Your voice, we are unable to hear you. Very low.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Still a little faint.
Okay, okay.
Can you use earphones, earplugs?
They won't connect in this.
Okay, then you can move a little closer to your device, maybe.
Okay, right now?
Yeah, better, much better.
Okay, so a very good morning to one and all present here. My name is Purva Mhatre and I'm a third year student at Jyotirlal School of Liberal Arts and MIMS Mumbai. And my paper is a working paper titled Spatializing Integration, Mapping the Production of the Space of Thane East. And my heritage site is basically Kopri Colony, which is located in Thane East, which is a Sindhi colony. So a very brief history of partition. If you look at the Sindhi narratives of partition, which have been written about by scholars like Rita Kothari and Nita Bhavnani, they speak about how the nascent government of India in 1947 was not prepared to take in the influx of refugees who had come in. And so the very first strategy of theirs was to A, discourage this entire migration as a whole, B, to encourage the refugees who had already come in to go back to where they had come from. But after a couple of years, and that is a year later itself, in 1948, the Bombay Refugee Act was passed, where the government basically realized that the military camps where these refugees were being located, which were from the Second World War, were already overflowing, and we needed to find a way to contain this refugee influx. And so the government passed the Bombay Refugee Act, which basically gave the government complete agency to move around the refugees wherever they wanted them to move around. So yeah, so this is where basically a couple of the government in the 1940s, in the late 1940s, there was this sense of, the government was in a period of waiting. The people were in a period of waiting. We did not know whether the refugees were here to stay permanently or whether things would settle down and they would be going back. But a couple of years later, in the 1950s, the early 1950s itself, it became quite evident that they are here to stay for permanently. And that is when the government decided that, we need to get them registered, we need to get them naturalized, we need to ask them to file in their compensation claims against the property that they had lost back at home. And in response to these claims that were filed, the government built the Sindhi colonies. There are 31 colonies all across Maharashtra. And one such military camp where the refugees were located in Thane was Kolshet camp. And the colony built closest to the Kolshet camp is the Kopri colony, which is situated in Thane East. So if you look at the Kopri colony itself, it was built in 1953, and some of the buildings were built in 1954. There are 25 buildings over here, 900 rooms, and all of these are spread across 18 acres of land. There are 2 commercial blocks that were given to the residents to kind of find a way to lead their mercantile culture, to continue with their employment, which is something that they were also doing back in the military camps. They had their kirana dukanas, their little convenience store, and they demanded the government to give them commercial blocks. So that demand was fulfilled. But the very first families to move in were quite late, that is in the 1956, and majority of them moved in the 1960s. Now, how my study began. My study originally was about looking at what kind of looking at this entire region of Thane East, right? Thane East is a region which is indigenous to the communities, to the Agri and Koli villages that are settled over there. That is the Kopri village and the Chenni village. And here, in 1947 was the first time where a quote-unquote outsider community came in and was located over here, that is the Sindhi colony. And for me, it was interesting to look at how must have the integration process taken place. What kind of structures, what kind of physical and social structures must have led to this integration? What must have allowed the locals to transgress this colony space and move in and out of that place? So that is where my study really began. But quite soon I found out. So this is a 1892 colonial map of Thane East from the municipal corporation.
Can you make that full screen, please? Because we are not able to see the map.
This one? This?
Your presentation, can you make it full screen?
Okay. Okay, sorry. Just a minute. Yeah.
Yeah, better. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is basically what my field looked like back in 1892. As you can see, A2 is basically where the Agri village is still, Kopri village. B2 is where the Koli village is, that is the Chenni village. And if we look at the history of this particular region, Sorry. Okay. If we look at the history of this particular region, as you can see, in 1892, you only have the Kopri village, that is the Agri village and the Koli village. And other than that, you have something called as the civil headquarters here. So in 1853 is when the British had first made the railways, laid the railways in Thane. And that was also around, which is something that has been recorded by the Thane Municipal Corporation, except for we don't quite know when the civil headquarters structures were built. But the civil headquarters structures is basically where the 12 bungalows for the British officers were built as vacation bungalows. And we also had a gymkhana over here. But they were here. The British were here to stay quiet for a very small temporary period of time, and they used to go back. So this is the first kind of outsiders coming into this indigenous space is what we see. And then the next community to come in into this space is the Sindhi community. So just yeah. So this is a memory map that I have included over here, which does not matter for now. So yeah. So basically, this is what the space looked like. But now, if you look at the space, if you look at the space between the civil headquarters and the B2, which is the Koli village, it's a completely blank white space. So the British people had purchased this entire region of civil headquarters as well as this empty space that you see between the civil headquarters and the B2 for their bungalows, but they ended up using only a particular amount of space, thus leaving out the rest of it, which was then passed on to the independent government of India. And this empty space was later used to erect the Sindhi colony. And today, if you see, the Sindhi colony is quite an important location in Thane East. It's the market of Thane East. This is what the region looks like now. Yes. So this is a draft development plan of Thane from 1986 to 2001. Now, soon, I kind of found out when I was doing my field work that this space, interestingly, although it's officially recognized, the colony as Kopri colony, the locals over there, that is the Agris and the Kolis, refer to this place as a camp. First of all, we are talking about the people back in the early 1950s, right? How did they come across a word as sophisticated, an English word as sophisticated as a camp, was the first question that I had to ask myself. And then the next question the next interesting thing that I noticed was how the locals had vernacularized the English term camp in their local language, and they used to call it campat and campan. And that's where my kind of study between why a camp and why not a colony, and what is the difference between a camp and a colony, because kind of began. So I soon realized that it's not a study that can be undertaken just about, how did the process of integration go about. It is a study that has to be taken up spatially and not just temporally, because as historians, we have a habit of, major events. How did the major events took place? We divide them temporally. But here I realized I needed to do it not just temporally, but also spatially, because the temporal events were being reflected in how the boundaries of this space were changing. And that is when I decided that a spatial study of integration would be quite interesting. Because if you look at camp studies that have been undertaken in the camp study scholarship, the refugee camp study scholarship so far, the spatialization of camp done by either Agamben or Simon Turner or Adam Ramadan, they spatialize camp within the boundaries of the camp itself. But I realized that we needed to go beyond the boundaries of this camp to really kind of explore the spatialization of camp and what does it mean to spatialize a camp. Secondly, I realized that in integration studies have often been criticized for relying a lot on social theory. That is when I also kind of decided that it would be quite fascinating to study integration spatially. My research objectives thus are to study the history of Khopri colony, to study how the colony space integrates with the neighborhood, to study the structures that allowed for the transgression of the colony borders by the locals, to study the limits of a refugee colony vis-a-vis a refugee camp. Now, my methodology was ethnography, and my methods were memory mapping and cultural mapping. I also used the cartography that was the maps that were available by the Thane Municipal Corporation. And then I used in-depth interviews by using snowball sampling, and my informants were those who have basically lived through the period, who have at least resided in every single one of these places. That is the Chenni village, the Khopri village, and Khopri colony for at least 65 years. And this is what the colony buildings look like. This is quite an interesting structure because imagine this structure in the early 1950s against the other kind of architecture that existed in that region, which was basically huts, jhopdas, where the Agri and the Koli people lived in joint families. So if we go back to this memory map over here, as you can see on the right, the black squares over here are basically the houses, and there were only 8 houses in the Khopri village itself, and everyone used to live in a joint family. So against this kind of an architecture, the architecture of the Sindhi colonies was quite drastic and glaring. Now, if we look at the evolution of the space of Khopri colony by itself, well, the Sindhis introduced the locals here to the concept of a market, to the concept of having kirana dukanas, convenience stores. The Agri and the Koli people initially they have their own farm, they have their own lands right beside their village settlement. They have their, as you can see here, there's a khadi. There's a water body over here, Moti Khadi, where they also have their salt pans and they used to fish and so on. So they were pretty self-sufficient in that sense, but if they ever wanted to buy anything, they had to cross the railway tracks. Now, the story of the railway tracks itself is quite interesting, right? The railway tracks come in and divide the region of Thane into east and west. So,
Purva, you have 3 minutes more. Okay.
Yes. So,
all right. And full screen, please.
Yeah. So, wait. Hanji. So basically, the people used to cross the tracks all the way to purchase if they wanted oil or such essential goods. They had to cross the tracks, which was quite risky because you had to walk across the tracks literally. And so when the Sindhis kind of came up in this commercial block, set up their own stores, they set up a dairy market, they set up a bakery, they set up a vegetable market, a meat market, convenience stores. This itself became, this entire region of Khopri colony became a marketplace where now the locals started purchasing from. Not only did they start purchasing from there, but they also started setting up their own stalls in this market, which legally was actually an encroachment because the entire 18 acres of land belonged to the Sindhis, which was given to them against their compensation claims. And on top of that, they also had to pay a certain price. This is what the marketplace looks like today. And so years have gone past by, and today the Sindhis don't quite live in this place. This place is rather, through cultural mapping, I found out, occupied by other migrants who have come here for employment and such. And these are their stalls. These are not the stalls of the Sindhi people. So the Sindhis have not only moved out of their place, but they have also created, as you can see over here, I've written Daulatnagar and Premnagar. Daulatnagar and Premnagar are two little towns literally on the right side of the Khopri colony, that is the Sindhi colony, that the Sindhis made for themselves. Now, if another thing that comes from kind of cultural mapping shows us is that the only informal settlements, the only slum settlements in Thane East are literally sprouted around only and only the Khopri colony, not the Khopri village or the Chenni village, only the Khopri colony, which makes one question, and this is what the informal buildings inside the colony look like now. So which makes us question, why are the informal settlements only located located around the Kopri colony. And one of the ways of answering this that I found out is to look at how the space has been understood. It was appalling for me to find out that the locals, that is the Agris and the Kolis, did not know that this Kopri colony, the buildings were given to the Sindhis against their compensation, and the Sindhis are also paid for it on top of that. They thought that this was given to them out of the goodwill of the government, and thus this was considered to be an abject space where the Sindhis had encroached, which the Sindhis had quote unquote encroached upon. And thus the perception of this particular space as an abject space led to this space being treated as an abject space in itself. It was open for anyone and everyone to come in and set up their stalls. And this is also where the interesting difference between colony and camp comes in, right? The difference between a colony and a camp is that the colony is a more formal structure that has been given to the Sindhis, and yet in the lifestyle, in the treatment of the space itself, it is not very different from a camp space. And this is where, for example, the statement of Doreen Massey, who is a spatial geographer, comes in, right? The way we imagine a space has certain effects, and this is something that you can see in this particular case. So what spatial integration, what spatial integration, a spatial study of integration shows us is that probably it was a mistake for the Indian government to design the colonies the way that they did, because already you are locating refugee settlements in this new host society where they have come in. You want to build structures in a way where you are, you are allowing for room for integration, but what you are rather doing by keeping them in these boundary colonies is separating them even more from their localities. And thus, this is what spatial study of integration allows us to do. And then on top of that, the informal settlements in there were later on regularized and so on and so forth. And the most important thing in integration study, other than the very fact of naturalization and giving citizenship and rights to the refugees, is giving them a sense of belongingness. Clearly, these Sindhi refugees moved out of this place and created their own little towns beside this place because they did not feel a sense of belongingness. Another interesting fact is to note that they did not move out anywhere else, but created their towns right beside this colony. So yeah, that is all that I have.
Yeah, okay. Right on.
That's my conclusion.
Okay,
so yeah, just a moment if I may. So my conclusion is basically that in spatial studies, how spatial studies have been thought of is that a space is a conceptual abstraction which designates its constituents. But where I intervene with this particular field study of mine is to look at how a space designates its constituents is not just by the bodies that reside on it, the actions that take place on it, the bureaucratic meaning that it is given, but also how it is perceived. That's all.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Purva, for that. Very interesting. I would like to call out to Janhavi Sarangi, Madiha Pathan, and Nikita Chauhan. If you're here, please say so in the chat box. I now call upon Vedanta Deshmukh to share his presentation. Vedanta, you have 10 minutes. Hi, Vedanta, and full screen, please.
Good morning, everyone. Today I'll be speaking about the cultural heritage of Mumbai under the Shilaharas.
Make your PowerPoint full screen. Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Firstly, I'll discuss the methods of study used. The primary method of study used was in-depth research, numerous sources like books, research journals, news articles, and government publications. Important reference sources were the Gazetteer of Maharashtra Government, the British Library, news bureaus like the Hindu, the Indian Express, Mumbai Mirror, and research papers from eminent scholars like Dr. Purusharar and A.S. Artekar. So coming to the abstract, the Shilaharas were a royal family who ruled western Maharashtra from the 8th to 13th century, and during their rule they developed the cultural sphere of Mumbai colossally. They were generous patrons of art and they were staunch devotees of Lord Shiva, and hence they constructed many beautiful temples in Mumbai and elsewhere. Many objects of archaeological importance from the Shilahar period have been found in Mumbai. And so the aim of this presentation is to highlight these historical and cultural aspects of the city of Mumbai under the rule of the Shilaharas. So I'll give a brief introduction of the Shilaharas. So the Shilaharas were a family who were principally divided into three branches. The North Konkan branch, which ruled over the modern-day districts of Mumbai, Thane and Raigad. The South Konkan branch, which ruled Ratnagiri and Sindhudurg and parts of North Goa. And the Kolhapur branch, which ruled over Kolhapur and parts of Sangli and Satara. So there are two mythical stories which have been discovered from the copper plates of the Shilaharas, which explain the origin of the Shilaharas. So the first story is related to King Vidyadhar Jimutvahan. He's a king who has been mentioned in the 7th century play Naganand. So according to the legend, he had sacrificed himself to rescue a Nag from the clutches of Garuda. The another legend relates to the aftermath of the battle between Varuna and Parshuram. Parshuram had shot an arrow at the sea to retrieve the western coast, and there is this guy named Shilara who had relieved the ocean from the suffering of the arrow, and this Shilara has been named as the progenitor of the Shilaharas. So the rule of the Shilara started in 750 AD and ended in 1265 AD. The first king was Kapardin I and the last king was Someshwar, was defeated by the Yadav king Mahadev. During the rule of 500 years, they generously patronized art and constructed grand temples, as I had mentioned in my abstract before, which had a distinctive cultural impact on Mumbai. Moving on to the first aspect, which is the temple, the Valkeshwar temple and Banganga tank. The Valkeshwar temple was built by Lakshman Prabhu, who was a minister in the court of the Shilaharas in 1127 AD. It is situated on Malabar Hill and was built to commemorate an incident from the Ramayana when Ram built a Shivlingam of sand to pray to Lord Shiva. The name of the temple also confirms this fact, as Valuka means sand and Ishwar means God. So Valkeshwar literally means sand god. This temple was destroyed by the Portuguese in the 16th century and was rebuilt in 1715 by a businessman named Rama Kamath. The Banaganga tank, it is a rectangular tank with steps on all its four sides and two pillars at the entrance. The source of the water is from an underground stream which was believed to be created when Lakshman shot an arrow to create a tributary of the river Ganga to quench Ram's thirst. There are several rock cut sculptures around the Banaganga tank which depict themes from Indian mythology and the early medieval society. So let us have a look at some of them. So this particular sculpture depicts a devotee meditating in Puchanu Mudra. The right hand has the thumb touching the index and the middle finger, and the left hand is broken, but it should have touched the it should have shown the thumb touching the middle and the ring finger. These are two rock panels. The panel on the left depicts Hanuman and his Vanasena, and the panel on the right depicts three standing figures with folded hands. The interesting thing to note is that similar patterns have been found in Shilara panels elsewhere, but the significance of it is not known yet. This sculpture depicts an archer holding a bow and reaching out for an arrow. It is probably an allusion to the legend of Banaganga, as it seems to depict Lord Ram and Lakshmana. We see two panels over here. The panel on the left is very exquisitely carved, but it is currently in a dilapidated condition. The panel lying on the right is incongruent because of the style of dressing that is depicted on it. We can presume that it is a North Indian style of clothing because such modest types of clothing were only prevalent in the colder regions of North India. Assuming that the person depicted on the figure is wearing a North Indian attire, we can assumed that people from north visited Mumbai as well, and that Walkeshwar was not only a local attraction, but Walkeshwar was not only a local attraction, but it attracted people from all over India. Next up, here are the Veergals at Banaganga. So Veergals are basically hero stones which commemorate fallen warriors. These Veergals are painted in vermilion as they depict Lord Hanuman, and it is a common practice to apply vermilion on Lord Hanuman's idol. The presence of such Veergals indicates that the Shilaharas were martial kings and they glorified war. The next aspect that is the Gadhigals. The Gadhigals are stones which record land grants and the punishment associated of the rules that came with the grant were offended. So the Gadhigals are primarily three zones. The topmost zone, that is the Kalasha and the sun and moon symbols. The middle zone that mostly contains a Devanagari inscription but is rarely blank. The Gadhigal depicted here is blank. And the lowermost panel depicts and has an explicit depiction of a female figure in sexual congress with a donkey. So the word Gadhegal has two explanations. The first one is Gadhe meaning donkey and Gal meaning stone. Another explanation of the word is Gadhe meaning donkey and Gal meaning a swear word. So there are two possible explanations for the explicit depiction on the Gadhegal. The first meaning is the direct physical one, that the offender's mother shall be forced into sexual congress with a donkey. And the second symbolic meaning is that the lady represents Mother Earth and the donkey is the Vahana of Sitala Devi, the goddess of plague. So it symbolically means that the offender's land will turn barren. Two significant Gadhigals have been found in Mumbai. The first one is at Pimpalwadi, Girgaon. The Gadhigal found there was worshipped as the Gram Devta by the locals. The second one at Chandivli Vageshwar temple, a half-buried Gadhigal was unearthed, the one depicted here. It was painted in vermilion as it was worshipped by the locals. So the Gadhigals basically depict two things. That first is the refinement in artisanship that was achieved under the Shilahars, and the second is the political power of the Shilahars. Basically things like the sovereignty and penal code. The Kanheri cave inscriptions. The Kanheri caves are Buddhist caves which were built in between 1st century BC to 9th century AD. There are Shilhara inscriptions in the Kanheri caves which indicate that they patronized the Kanheri caves. The second Shilahar king Pullashakti has left an abraded inscription in cave 73, in which he is called a Mahasamant and described as the lord of Puri Konkan, which he had obtained from the favor of the Rashtraput king Amogharsh. The date at the end is presumed to be Shaka 765 or 843 AD. The inscription also records the endowment of 24 drammas made by one Vishnugupt for the caves. Coming to the next aspect, that is the Veergals. Veergals are hero stones, as I mentioned before, which were erected to commemorate martyrdom. They usually depict battle scenes, figures of deities, and inscriptions describing the battle. The significant Veergals found in Mumbai from the Shilahar period are the Eksar Veergals, which were found near Borivali station. The Eksar Veergals are 6 feet tall and depict the naval battle that took place between the Shilahar king Someshwar and Yadav king Mahdev in 1265 AD. We can infer from the Veergals that the battle was fought on both land and naval fronts. That is also depicts of fighting elephants. These Veergals also indicate that Shilaharas had naval capabilities. And these Veergals are currently worshipped by the locals as their goddesses. And they mainly depict the military prowess of the Shilaharas and also the fact, as I had mentioned before, that they glorified war. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Vedant, for that. It was really nice. And You stuck to the time. Thank you. And okay, we had three other participants, Janavi Sarangi, Madiha Pathan, and Nikita Chauhan, but I don't think they are here now. I would request the judges to please give us their comments. Dr. Soni, would you like to give your comments first?
Sure. This was a very enjoyable set of presentations today morning. Vishal's work on salt pans and how they're disappearing fast and degraded. A lot of empirical work, field visits, excellent exploration. But the conclusion was, in a sense, quite obvious. There was the work was empirical, but there was no philosophical problem that was posed, and therefore there was nothing that was solved. With Purva, the Kopri colony study again is pioneering in the sense nobody has done this before. Again, very good empirical work, both in terms of anthropological and also studying urban patterns. Perhaps using tools like Google Earth, which are so easily available, might be one more way to carry out this exploration further. And then Vedanta's presentation on the Shilaharas was also very nice. I might not agree with all the inferences he made, such as sculpture being shaped by North India because of the style of clothing. It's a late sculpture, and this style of clothing can be found all across India. But again, a very commendable effort to look at things and come up with explanations and meanings for them. In any case, I wonder if Professor Dandekar has anything to say.
Yes.
Yeah.
Requested.
Thank you, Pushkar. Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are.
Fine. Yeah. I mean, I should thank the Asiatic Society for this excellent endeavor, and being a Bombayite myself, I'm really enjoying it. So thanks once again to you. Coming to this presentations, Vishal's presentation, Salt Pan, is really very interesting. But certain things I would like to suggest to Vishal is that certain things were not clear to me at least. This common salt, for example, this common salt manufacturing company, was it a governmental endeavor, or was it a private venture or a cooperative thing? Secondly, the Kohlis and Agnis were already there, and hence their services were used for manufacturing salt, or they were manufacturing salts before the company came up, and the company just took advantage of it. Again, I was a bit confused, and more importantly, the entire agitation by Mahatma Gandhi on Salt Act and what effect did it have on this salt manufacturing. Again, that would have been a component which probably was, I think, necessary. When it comes to Purva's presentation, again, as Pushkar said, a very original topic, and at a very micro level, handled at a very micro level. So very in-depth study done. And as Pushkar said, that if she had used some Google Earth software and look at this just to show and make her point more elaborate with the help of Google Images, Google Earth Images, it would have been better. For Vedant's presentation, I would suggest Vedant to include one more aspect or one more spot of the Shilahar activity was in Mahim. I think Siddharth Kale and Rajesh Pujari have presented on this. They found some elements of temple. And if I'm not wrong, they're published in the Journal of the Asiatic Society, Mumbai. So if we had taken help of that, we would have added one more point. Again, as Pushkar said, that some of the sculptures appear to be of late period. Even the Gadegals that he showed, there is no way to date them because there are no inscriptions. It is quite possible that they are of later period also. So such things have to be taken into consideration. And I was actually looking forward to rest the three presentations. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, they could not make it today. We were also looking forward to the rest of the 4 presentations. So Dr. Soni and Dr. Dandekar, a couple of questions to you. And also before that, participants, if you have any questions, please to post them in the chat box. We will take it up from there. How would you advise the students to go about research? There are many students in the participants in our session today, so it would be very useful for them to have your guidance. So, Dr. Dandekar, if you could go first, and then after that, Dr. Soni.
Yeah, I mean, it is really commendable of Vishal that to carry out this fieldwork. Fieldwork is essential. As an archaeologist, I can tell you the fieldwork is essential. Actually, to go on site and visit the places, and then you see the change that has taken place over there. Because my experience is, I mean, you have all sorts of data from historical documents, and then you have a very beautiful kind of picture that a pristine site is waiting for you to. Pristine site is waiting for you to explore. But such is not the case. Things change drastically, and then when you go there, you see nothing. And then you have to sift through a lot of layers of later developments and later activities and later habitations to actually come to the fore. So one needs a lot of patience. So to all students, I would say that patience is the most important thing that you need if you are carrying out research, especially of the historical period, be it Shilahar period, or be it the Yadav period, or be it even the British period or early independent period of independence. So that one thing is there. Again, there are diverse sources that you can go through, and it is all. And I'm very happy to see that we shall go through original sources. So original sources are very, very important. Also, the secondary sources and tertiary sources, and as I think Purva dealt with, is the local traditions and oral history. That also forms a very important aspect of your research when you carry out such things. That many things which are not present, which cannot be seen, are preserved in oral traditions. Purva's analysis of this camp versus colony was very, very interesting, and I liked it very much. And secondly, as Vedant, my takeaway point from Vedant's presentation is that things are just scattered over there. They're not there in their original context. So you actually have to kind of put everything together piece by piece, and then try to. It's like solving a jigsaw puzzle where many pieces are missing, and you need to put them at the right place and then see what picture they make. It might happen that at first point, when you're doing it for the first time, you place it somewhere else and you think that was the proper place, but you might have to change it again. So point is that you keep on working on your methodology, you keep on working on your sources, you keep on question your sources and question your methodology again and again till you come up with the right pictures. And that again, I will come back to the same thing, that again requires a lot of patience. So be patient, be thorough, be original, and be hardworking. If you want to succeed in the field of research, these are the 4 points I would advise to young students. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dandekar. I'm sure that's going to be very useful to the students. Dr. Soni, would you like to comment? And Mr. Narayan Swami, we take up your question after Dr. Soni has made his comments. Dr. Soni?
Sure. So I think to do good research, first you need to have a kind of burning curiosity about what it is you're studying, why things are the way they are. And this kind of curiosity has to come from within. It should not be. We often get students who come and say, sir, could you suggest a research topic? And I think finding an appropriate research topic that throws up questions that interest you is hard work, and people need to do that first. There are no ready-made problems on a shelf that people can pick up and take away and then try to solve them. And then what Professor Dandekar said was absolutely right. I mean, there is no substitute to fieldwork, because you never get the kind of experiential feel of a place. It gives you insights. Suddenly you look at something and it hits you. You say, ah, this must be the way it is because the sun comes in at this angle. Something that photographs or archival sources can never tell you. You just have to be there, and you suddenly have epiphanies. You suddenly realize the way things are. And of course, along with that, which I was happy to see everybody has done some of, is archival research. I mean, apart from fieldwork, there are three things you have to do. You have to read, and then you have to read more, and then you have to read even more. There is no substitute to reading. And there is a lot of scholarship. It might be piecemeal, it might be patchy, but there is a lot of scholarship. People have given some thought to most things that we look at, and one should be able to really internalize all of it, understand when it is that different people have written about places and events in the past, how their own circumstance colors it completely. So you cannot uncritically treat somebody who writes in 1880 and somebody who writes in 1980 in exactly the same way. There are very different contexts even to scholarship, and one has to understand the context in which certain scholarship was produced. So yes, first you have to at least have a working hypothesis. You have to know what it is you want to work on and why, and that has to be raging within you. You have to visit the field, and you have to read everything that is written about and around whatever it is you're working on. There is no substitute for these.
I would like to make one more point. Can I?
Yes, of course, of course.
Yeah. One thing, especially students of history and who want to pursue their careers in history, one thing that is absolutely necessary and which I see lacking in many of the scholarships nowadays is that do not get involved in your history. You should be as objective as possible to the historical topic that you are researching. For example, as a Maharashtrian, as a Marathi, I might be very, fond of Shivaji Maharaj, and I will be very, boastful of Shivaji's activities. But as a historian, I cannot afford to do that. I have to look at Shivaji and his exploits and his times as dispassionately and as objectively as possible. I cannot consider Mughals as my enemies. They were Shivaji's enemies. Okay? I cannot consider British as my enemy. Right? I mean, that era was there and they fought the Battle of Independence, and after all the struggle, 150 years, we got independent. So today, Narendra Modi happens to be my prime minister and Uddhav Thackeray happens to be my chief minister. That's the baseline. I do not live in Swarajya. I do not live in medieval times. I live in modern times in 21st century. So that sense has to be there if you want to look at things objectively. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Very valid points. And Mr. Narayan Swamy, would you like to ask a question? You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my name is actually Pandurang. Narayan Swamy is my dad's name. Thanks.
Okay. All right, Mr. Pandurang, you can ask a question.
Yeah, I am a Mumbaikar, and I'm not a historian or a scholar in that sense. And I would like to just play a different perspective. Looking at the presentation on salt pans as well as the one on Thane, I really wonder what was the economic compulsions and the motivations which probably has led to this encroachment, not only of the salt pans and who is benefiting from the sale of the land over there, plus also whether there was a motivation economically for the Sindhis to encroach on, sorry to use the term Sindhis, the settlers from Sindh who encroached on the land adjoining the two buildings. And that would be a very interesting economic consideration to really look at. Could you hear me? Sorry. Could you hear my questions?
I'm sorry, I lost connection. Who would take that question, please? Mr. Pandura?
Yeah, did you hear my question or no?
No, we
No,
heard
I lost you because my connection was poor.
Whom is your question addressed to?
Yeah, who is it addressed to?
Yeah, it's actually a comment, the economic aspect of the two presentations. It's a comment.
It was a comment. All right. Okay. Dr. Soni and Dr. Dandekar, would you like to respond to that?
I mean, it is a valid point, and it might take both these studies in a completely different direction. However, again, the presenters today will have to take up these questions and move ahead with them. So certainly, I think they should consider the economic implications of both settlements and salt making.
Dr. Dandekar?
Hello. Yeah, I think Purva tried to tackle it to a certain extent, and when she talked about the difference in architecture and the general difference in the activities carried out by the Sindhis and by the local people. Sindhis, I mean, we all know that they came from a very enterprising background, and they would probably would again try to expand their businesses or restart their businesses. Even if they are relocated. Now, a very interesting thing that came to my mind is that a natural kind of growth as against law. So many times, because we are controlled by law, and because of that, we can use the term, and we tend to use the term encroachment. But when it comes to human activities, if you look at human beings as, a collection of human beings, a collective of human beings as a community, and it's trying to expand, there could be times when the legal system and this expansion drive would be at loggerheads. And hence, I mean, we tend to, when we use the word encroachment, I think Purva tried to highlight that point, that encroachment, quote unquote. Again, one has to look at it from a different perspective. And we know that this has been happening for a very long time, again, especially in Mumbai, all sorts of different kinds of marshlands or government lands, railway lands have been encroached by people. That also, when you look at it from a different point of view, is like expansion and spread of their activities, where the legal systems and their zeal to expand are at loggerheads. So again, that has to be taken into consideration.
Great, thank you for that. Himanshu asks a question. He says, in the current scenario, what research will be useful to conduct? It's a very broad question actually, but if you would like to take that one. And I'd request all others who are not asking questions to please mute themselves. Do not unmute yourselves, please. Thank you. Yes, Dr. Dandekar.
Yeah. I mean, what research? I really didn't get the question.
Yeah.
What research is necessary?
Himanshu, would you like to ask the question specifically? Himanshu?
I mean, I would say, Himanshu, take up any research that interests you.
Yes. Yes.
As Pushkar said, I mean, it has to come from within.
Yeah.
The urge of curiosity.
Yeah.
If I may use, I'm sorry to use this word, but typical Bombay word. If you have that khujli of research, you can do it anything. Yeah. You can work on your own colony, look at its own history, how it came up. If you stay in cooperative society, you can always see the entire movement of cooperative housing societies coming up in Mumbai, different bank colonies and different people coming together and establishing, buying a land, getting permission from the government. That's a very interesting history to see the settlement pattern of Mumbai. How these different wadis in the suburbs of Mumbai, be it Bandra or be it Santa Cruz, Khar, all these were wadis which were owned by a particular community, were sold to these cooperative societies, and then the demography of Mumbai changes, and the entire character of the suburban Mumbai changes because of this. So that itself is a very interesting topic you can take up.
Yeah, so I think what he's written here, I think what he means is specifically in historical research areas, what are the new things that he can possibly take up? I think that's what he meant.
Okay. Yeah, again, as I said, I mean, I mean, you define your own historical
Very
period.
broad, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you can start off with something as simple as look at the kind of street trades in Mumbai.
Yeah.
20 years ago, you didn't have a profusion of small stores that repaired cell phones. Now you find these mobile repair shops and professionals everywhere.
Yeah.
But there are also trades that have disappeared completely, like the Kalhaiwala, who used to tin your vessels.
I was about to say that.
Yes.
Kalaiwala ji, yeah.
Is a disappearing breed. People who sharpen your knives, who used to go around, you find them, but they're much fewer. You talk to people 70, 80 years ago, and there were a group of specialized people who would go around asking if there was a well, and they would recover everything that you had dropped in the well over the year.
Really?
And so that's another profession that's gone because wells have gone. And I guess people don't drop things in them anymore.
Things in the well anymore.
But I mean, you just look around you and you'll see a lot that you can study.
Yes. So
one such profession was there, no? You don't see Bohari anywhere now.
If I may intrude, I found a Kallaiwala after a great hunt. It was such a relief because all those, we still have Kallai vessels which I couldn't use, and it was, of course, it's expensive getting it done, but I was relieved that I eventually found one and not that far from where I live. So you're quite right that so many of these earlier trades we used to take for granted are disappearing.
And while we have kind of lament and nostalgia for things that have disappeared, also look around to see the new trades that have come up. It's not like there is a loss of trades. There are new skills that are required. So 100 years ago, you wouldn't have had auto mechanics, which you now find on every street corner. And we, of course, don't value them in the moment that they are vibrant and alive. It's only once they start disappearing, we start ruining the loss.
Also, Ankur says, cotton pinzara the
yes,
tapos pinzara those
pinzari,
are also,
pinzari, yeah.
Pinzari.
So what is relevant remains, what is irrelevant goes. We can feel sad, we can lament about them, but again, they become irrelevant and they go. I mean, I feel very sorry when I go to the Phoenix Mill for some dinner, and I can never go there myself to look at those empty chimneys and things like that. That saddens me a lot. But again, I mean, as a historian, I would just take it that, I mean, that was probably forced to be irrelevant and it has gone.
Okay, great. Thank you. And would you like to, both of you, declare a winner now? Or should we, would you like to let us know and then,
Though this was meant to be something to judge, I think it's unfair to anybody to declare a winner. I think it should be done in the spirit of sharing more than, but we'll come back to you. We'll just have a quick word.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sirs, thank you very much for accepting our invite. My personal thanks, Dr. Sohoni and Dr. Dandekar, for offering to judge. We deliberately decided to get two Punekars to judge Mumbaikars. To keep this great rivalry.
Ramesh, do not call me a Punekar. I stay in Pune. I am very much a Mumbaikar.
Okay. Well, you're a Mumbai Punekar.
Yeah.
So, but thank you very much for accepting our invitation and taking time out on a Sunday morning to judge them. The good thing is that since there are only 3 people who presented in the finals, all of them are due to get something or the other. It's just in what rank they get it. So congratulations to all 3 of our presenters. And I think you guys were really lucky that you had mentors in your schools and colleges to encourage you into research. When we went to school and college, we hardly had any tradition of research. And I think you're luckier that you've had judges like Dr. Dandekar and Dr. Sohoni, such absolute multifaceted personalities. I don't think there is an aspect of historical, archaeological, architectural, numismatic, epigraphic, manuscriptological research that they have left untouched. And Therefore, I would encourage you researchers to, stay in touch both with the MRC and with our judges to really hone your research skills. The whole purpose of the MRC is, of course, to promote research exactly like this. So I have two concluding points. Those of you who have the youth and the energy to do research, please submit grant proposals to the MRC. We exist to encourage and fund and guide research like this. And those who have the age and the money, please sponsor the MRC so that we can encourage young people to do the research. And with that, thank you very much. We will declare this session closed.
Ramesh,
Thank you so much.
Yes, sir.
I think we just had a word and we've decided on what sequence, what hierarchy to assign awards. And so and I hate to again make this some kind of ranking, but we thought that the first place should really go to Purva because it's completely original. There is no such work done on Kopri colony. In second place will be Vishal, which is also original work. And in third place will be Vedant, who, though this material has been published, he really is trying to look at it in very original ways and think through it on his own.
So congratulations, all three of you. Thank you, judges, for the ranking. Purva, Vishal, and Vedant, please take a bow. If you want to say thank you to the judges, please, this is your chance.
Thank
I know the sound of
all of you.
odd on Zoom, but Vedant, Purva, Vishal.
Yes, sir.
Anything to say?
Yes, sir. Actually, I want to answer the few questions which were asked by Dr. Dandekar, sir. Basically, the questions, basically, the Common Salt Manufacturing Company, it was private company which was established in 1915, and basically, according to them, when I measured the area of the total salt pan which was flanking on that Bombay Port Trust Road, it was 60.55 hectares. But according to them, when I interviewed, the total kind of salt procurement, it was only from the available 112 acres of the land. And basically, because of the conclusion which I made, possibility because this was only one company which had been kind of established in colonial period in before 1947, which was responsible for the salt production from the Vadaland coastal region, Vadaland Sivri salt pan areas, and other the private companies which emerged after the 1947. They were kind of extracting the salts from the other areas from the same land, but there are no kind of the records which have I have found out regarding the salt procurement by the other companies. And basically I could see the borewell and the pipeline which was dredged, which was responsible for the because of the environmental degradation of the saline creeks areas of the Vadaland Sivri. So this was kind of the new thing. After 1995, they started using the borewell method. So this was basically the.
Thank you, Vishal.
Thank you, Vishal. Thank you, Vishal.
Now really need
Yes,
to move
sir.
on to the next session. So thank you, winners. Thank you, judges. And thank you to the audience. I now hand it over to the host and co-host for the next session.